and I would be happy to field questions and get your feedback as I go through this, or maybe we can wait till the end. Might be easiest. I'll take about 15-20 minutes, I expect. As Christy said, we released this report last week. About 3 weeks ago, we released some analysis related to the potential economic impact. But in this paper, we took some time to try to understand the potential budget revenue and fiscal impacts that the state and local governments would be facing as a result of this. We recognize we are still very much in a period of incredible uncertainty about the near-term and lasting impacts of this, but want to put together a framework with numbers that are currently understood and currently being estimated in terms of how this will play out. So for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're an organization that does public policy research on a range of economic and fiscal issues across the state, and look to put out papers, informational pieces that are used to inform the debate, ultimately to improve public policy and improve our way of life here and improve economic vitality here in the state. The way that this paper is outlined and the framework that we've used to look at this issue is really trying to get a handle on three layers, if you will, or three aspects of this debate. That is the expected reductions in revenue, given the uncertainty and given some of the underlying moving pieces that we think will be most impactful due to this crisis. The simultaneous increase in demand for government resources and services, we think that is occurring and will continue to occur for some period of time as a result of this crisis, that I think is important to recognize. And then ultimately how this might play out in the overall budget, or at least the different components that lawmakers and legislators are considering when you weigh how the simultaneous sort of reduction in revenue, increase in demand for resources, along with federal stimulus will ultimately play out in the budgeting discussion. So this is a slide that was released 3 weeks ago now by the Governor's Office of State Planning and Budget, which has really been very useful in describing the potential and likely consequences of the current crisis, and how actions that have been taken to ultimately protect human life and maintain public health have, undoubtedly will undoubtedly be dealt with through the economic and fiscal ramifications. And I think that's what we're trying to help parse through and understand as we face sort of a crisis on multiple fronts. So this is a slide they put together. This does not represent an official estimate, an official budgetary or fiscal estimate. We do anticipate, and guidance we've received from the state suggests that prior to this, the continuation of the legislative session, that the Legislative Council and the Office of State Planning and Budget will release updated budget forecasts and economic forecasts for the state outside of their normal quarterly cycle. So we do expect these numbers to be updated, but I think again they paint the picture that there will be a very severe impact in the near term in fiscal year the fiscal year 20, which will end in the next 2-3 months at the end of June here, and then fiscal year 2021, which will be the budget legislators have to finalize when they come back and continue the session. But then looking forward, if you look at fiscal year 2022, already a projected $2.5 billion reduction in revenue, that is about an 18% reduction in general fund revenue from where estimates were just a month ago. So again, very severe reductions in anticipated revenue, and then even further into fiscal year 2023 as the economy likely does rebound, but ultimately wouldn't be at the level that were previously projected. So that's a cumulative impact of over $6.7 billion over the next three to four budget cycles. And the state's reserves currently stand at about $1 billion, and the current amount of anticipated federal aid is around $2.5 billion. So we'll come back to this slide and revisit this, but to understand the implications of this, I think it's very important to consider, again, not just the immediate crisis and the impact on near term, but when you look at budgets and you look at the impact on state and local budgets, the ramifications will be felt for years to come, for several years to come. In coming out of the 2009 recession, financial crisis, the overall state spending did not actually see a turn downward until fiscal year 2012. So that's the total budget, 2.5 years after the start of the crisis. And so you can see here, these are some preliminary projections that compare alternative economic forecasts, considering Moody's updated baseline against previous projections. And you can see that reach 2019 levels in terms of overall GDP late 2021. But by the end of this projection in 2023, we're still not at the level the state was projected to be. And I think this dynamic is important to understand because population is still growing, demand is growing, and so on a per capita basis, revenue will be lower for likely years to come. We released about a month ago now 2 scenarios related to potential economic impacts when we were just facing this crisis and trying to very early on understand the economic ramifications. We released a couple scenarios that isolated very severe direct impacts in some of the sectors that are being most directly impacted, and that is retail, arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, food service and drinking places, so restaurants, ski resorts. And through some of these scenarios, and we don't need to necessarily focus too heavily on the specific numbers, but what we found when we simulated very severe contractions in these 4 sectors, essentially losing 50% of revenue for a full quarter or half of a quarter, is that less than, roughly 2/3, so 63% of the total job loss as a result of these contractions occurred in those sectors directly impacted, and therefore 37% of the total job loss were in other sectors. So while I think what we're seeing play out is very severe contractions in very specific sectors that are most directly impacted and have the most significant challenges maintaining social distancing and accommodating public health guidelines. Ultimately, the broader economy is very severely impacted because of these direct impacts in maybe just a few industries. Now, what we're seeing play out in the near term and right now is far greater and far broader than what we're seeing, than what we modeled back then. So just some other points to consider in terms of the near term and long term. Obviously, we think that what is occurring in the oil and gas market, even before the news yesterday, would have been headline news and impacted revenue for years, for several budget cycles to come, had it not been for the COVID-19 crisis. And from according to a legislative council memo in early January, oil and gas revenues in Colorado contributed about $775 million in state and local tax revenue. 64% of that tax revenue was in the form of local property taxes to local governments. And so, just a 50% reduction in property tax revenue amounts to over $250 million in reduced local property tax revenue, again, that will not be felt for several years to come. This is a chart that's updated with the latest figures related to unemployment insurance claims, new claims here in Colorado. This shows that over the last 4 weeks, the 4 weeks that have been the most severe in terms of crisis and impact on economic activity, we've seen a cumulative impact that amounts to over roughly 7.5% of the Colorado labor force has filed for unemployment insurance. Still, Colorado is faring relatively better than the rest of the country, where though that figure, that estimate is over 13%. So 13% of U.S. labor force has filed for unemployment insurance, and here it's just been 7.3. Again, relative, but you can see that this rise in unemployment claims for unemployment insurance is absolutely unprecedented in the history, and points to a very severe crisis. Some analysis by the Tax Foundation, which is a national organization which is updated weekly. They're updating now weekly. They have projected that the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund here in Colorado has funds to remain solvent to maintain and pay benefits for the next 8 weeks. So that number is expected to be revised downward likely when we see another week of new claims, but again points to the severity of the near-term crisis and the crunch that this fund may be in to find new sources of revenue through new taxes on businesses, which are the primary source of funding, possibly additional federal funding. There's several states that are in much worse positions. Texas, California, and New York, according to that same Tax Foundation analysis, have less than 3 weeks of funds available to remain solvent in their trust funds, unemployment insurance trust funds. Some of the longer term impacts that I think are very important to consider when it comes to the budgetary impacts is to recognize where the demand for resources will come from that we've seen experience coming out of the previous recession as well. And the one of them will be the likely increase in Medicaid enrollment. So here we can see that that Medicaid enrollment, both in the Medicaid expansion population and the traditional enrollment population, has grown significantly since prior to the recession, despite to the 2009 recession, despite relatively historically low unemployment rates. And so as we see the Medicaid enrollment likely increase, this puts additional pressure on the general fund. In the last decade, Medicaid has seen its share of the general fund increase by over 7%. And so for years to come, we do expect, again, contributions and that commitment from the general fund to be greater. One piece to the budget, which again may not be an immediate budgetary need in the next year or two, undoubtedly, but as we've seen with recent reform debates in 2018, we do expect that because of the severe drop in the financial markets, that PARA's overall funding levels will likely take a significant hit and require either an increase in contributions or further reductions in benefits, both of which are going to be very challenging. But if for those of you that followed the debate through 2018, there was an allowance to have the contribution rate increased by an additional 2% through an automatic adjustment mechanism. We do expect that if it wasn't already going to be triggered, will undoubtedly occur going forward and will not be sufficient to keep the funds on track to pay off the unfunded liability within 30 years. And so therefore will be, again, a significant portion of the policy debate likely for years to come. Here's an outline of information from a Joint Budget Committee memo on what is currently estimated in terms of both programmatic and grant appropriations from federal stimulus packages, along with expected direct state and local direct disbursements through the Coronavirus Relief Fund as part of the CARES Act. And it shows, again, here, roughly $2.1 billion in total expected direct funds to state government programs and state and local governments. I think this is very critical to understand if you're in the budgeting world, but I think from an economic standpoint and a macro standpoint, as noted in the Joint Budget Committee memos, these funds are to be used explicitly for unanticipated expenses due to COVID-19 crisis, and are not to be used for revenue losses, essentially filling revenue losses through to reduced economic activity. So that will ultimately come down to the ability of the state reserve, which stands at about $1 billion, to play that, maintain that function, along with some of the indirect impacts from the federal government and the federal stimulus. So as the federal stimulus helps maintain payroll, helps increase unemployment insurance benefits. Unemployment insurance benefits are taxable. The federal stimulus to households is not taxable, but some of that direct stimulus will maintain potentially the budget and the ability to maintain current levels of services for at least through the next budget cycle. But clearly, we face very significant crises when you look a little further out over the next budget. So not that this would be a recommendation by any means, but to give you a sense of the scale of the impact of $3 billion across the state budget, that amounts to the total budget for 15 state agencies, including public safety, judicial department, public health and the environment, all regulatory agencies. It also is the same, equals the same that is appropriated to transportation and all of the highway user trust fund revenue and human services on an annual basis. So again, these do not represent recommendations on how the budget will be balanced, but you can see the scale of the impacts when it comes to the current appropriation levels across each state department, and how coming up with $2 to $3 billion reductions might be, again, very, very challenging and cause some significant problems for certain departments. So, as we all know, the economy has changed significantly, and the implication for this is that the state budget that lawmakers face has done a 180 from where it was just a few weeks ago, seeing record highs in terms of revenue. We do expect long-term budget pressures to come forward that I think are very important for lawmakers, local officials, state officials to recognize as you consider priorities and policy over the coming months. And federal stimulus will be useful in many ways to cover new expenses, such as the transition to online learning for education, but will be less able to fill revenue shortfalls, which again could be very severe and pose challenging questions for lawmakers and budget makers. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to questions and comments and any additional insights that people here on the call might have. So thank you.